I went on holiday to the USA in May of 2016. I have a distinct memory of walking through the Mission District in San Francisco and passing a bookstore. In the door of this bookstore, someone had stuck a really nice hand-drawn picture of the wrestler, Macho Man Randy Savage, who had recently passed away. In the window of this bookstore were a little gang of piñatas designed to resemble Donald Trump. One was holding a sign advertising a mail service that the store offered. Deport Trump to another location. $40 to ship Trump piñata. And it pointed you to the associated website, mexevents.com. I take a photo, and I laugh. Because it was funny at the time.
Instantly they dived into find where she lives, find where all these people live, what are we going to do about her, can we hack her email, like instantly.
Beaten, raped, and run over by cars.
They sent me a series of threats that was so serious that law enforcement got involved, and I actually fled my home for several days.
And now the women calling for change in this multi-billion-dollar virtual industry are facing a very real backlash, including death threats.
For Anita Sarkeesian, this is the new normal. Armed escorts at public events, tracking her every move.
The sense of violence against women being used as almost background decoration, right? As texture to make an environment gritty.
I mean, I've taught young girls how to make games, and I know they're watching, and I know if they leave, they're going to see it. I have a folder on my desktop called Those Who Left, and every time somebody sends me a message saying like, hey, I really admire your strength, but it's not worth it for me, I'm leaving.
How big's the folder?
It's disturbingly big.
This episode is not about GamerGate, but it takes GamerGate as its starting point, and is concerned with reactions to it. And so, when I sat down to write the intro to the show, which I envisage as a breezy summary of it before moving on to the main event, it's at that point that I realise exactly how in over my head I am. It's now 12 years since the online schism that came to be described as GamerGate occurred. The phrase entered our shared lexicon immediately, though I feel the specifics of it have been lost to time. 12 years is nothing in the grand scheme, but post-Web 2.0, post-accelerated cultural inertia, that is a huge gulf of time. A white, cis-het male, completely unaffected by the machinations of GamerGate, who was kind of disengaged from gaming at the time and subsequently ignorant of what happened when it was happening. I'm not someone who should be attempting to talk analytically about it. It feels redundant and shallow to do so, but cowardly to not. And so I'll attempt some setup that honours some of those affected without patronising them with any white privileged saviour stuff. GamerGate is the snappy but glib phrase used to describe an online harassment campaign instigated by a blog post by indie developer Zoe Quinn's ex-boyfriend that falsely claimed her game Depression Quest had received a favourable review because of her relationship with Kotaku and RPS journalist Nathan Grayson. That blog post kicked off an online riot of the worst extremes of the gaming audience, a sustained campaign of harassment claiming to be motivated by a desire for improved ethics in games journalism, but in fact simply a mask and vehicle for the most reductive, misogynistic, sexist, anti-feminist, anti-progressive and downright embarrassing views out there, perpetrated by people operating under the comically thin-skinned theory that their identity as gamers is being threatened by the existence of games that don't have guns in them. Mostly conducted through, of course, anonymous message boards such as 4chan and Reddit, Quinn, along with other prominent voices in the independent gaming scene, such as Anita Sarkeesian and Brianna Wu, is the target of various threats. Doxing, rape, death. So increasingly unpleasant that reading about it now is a head-spinning, scarcely believable experience. Quinn documented the experience online, leading to a further upswell in abuse, leading her to cancel multiple public appearances and for her and her family to leave their home. The same is true of Anita Sarkeesian, a feminist media critic most noted for her incisive, hilarious YouTube series Tropes vs. Women in Video Games. Sarkeesian received similar threats and had a public appearance at Utah State University cancelled after 3 anonymous calls were made claiming her talk would be the target of a weaponized attack. Brianna Wu, indie game dev and co-founder of studio giant Space Cat, had her address and personal information posted online, subsequently leaving her home and being diagnosed with PTSD. As of April 2015, Brianna Wu had received 45 death threats. This is, of course, just the tip of the iceberg. The 3 highest profile targets of an air quotes movement that abused anyone, male or female, that it saw as committing the crime of being progressive or supportive of diversity. Now, I'm not equipped to make this a history lesson, and nor should it be, because there is over 10 years of far more enlightened coverage from people with a far more valuable and relevant perspective than mine. But I shouldn't ignore or gloss over the endless, bottomless well of crimes that supporters of GamerGate committed. First, a couple of positives that came out of the whole mess. In January 2015, Quinn and Alex Lifshitz created the Crash Override Network, a private group of experts who provide free support and counsel to those who had been harassed online, including as a result of GamerGate, and they worked with law authorities and social media sites in response to those threats. Software developer Randy Harper founded a similar group, the Online Abuse Prevention Initiative, a non-profit organisation that also sought to provide aid to those harassed online. Also, weirdly, Intel committed over $300 million to support a diversity in technology program that partnered with Sarkeesian's Feminist Frequency organisation, intended to increase the number of women and minorities in the industry. And the big voices say all the right things. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, the ESA, Blizzard, Sony, Nintendo, all of them denounce GamerGate and the whole concept of online harassment. Anita Sarkeesian is named by Time magazine as one of the 30 most influential people on the internet in 2015, and her work at highlighting sexism lauded. South by Southwest starts hosting online abuse panels. Barack Obama, in his time as president, acknowledges the effects of online harassment, encouraging the victims to speak up to bring the perpetrators to justice. Which is all well and good, but nowhere near enough. Kez McDonald wrote that the games industry's silence was deafening, while Anita Sarkeesian, in a retrospective on GamerGate published on Polygon in 2019, wrote that the same industry's silence was shameful. The voices of those affected are really the only ones that matter, and are the ones to whom we should turn in any attempt to pass the effects of GamerGate. Their words should guide us. Sarkeesian said this, quote, "Online harassment, especially gendered online harassment, is an epidemic. Women are being driven out. They're being driven offline. This isn't just in gaming. This is happening across the board online, especially with women who participate in or work in male-dominated industries," end quote. Brianna Wu published an article on Polygon in 2014 made up of case studies of her game development peers, documenting their experiences with online harassment. It's a harrowing read that you should read. Here's the bit that struck me, quote, "I've personally never heard of a man in the games industry getting rape threats for having an opinion. A male friend of mine that develops AAA games told me, when a woman criticises me, it goes to a different part of my brain than when a man on my team does. I get defensive really quickly. I'm trying to get better about it." I don't think his is a unique experience. We live in a society that's sexist in ways it doesn't understand. One of the consequences is that men are extremely sensitive to being criticised by women. I think it threatens them in a very primal way, and male privilege makes them feel free to lash out. This is why women are socialised to carefully dance around these issues, disagreeing with men in an extremely gentle manner. Not because women are nicer creatures than men, but because our very survival can depend on it, end quote. Finally, we should return to Zoe Klein, who said this, quote, "GamerGate wasn't really about video games at all so much as it was a flashpoint for radicalised online hatred that had a long list of targets before and after my name was added to it. The movement helped solidify the growing connections between online white supremacist movements, misogynist nerds, conspiracy theorists and dispassionate hoaxers who derive a sense of power from disseminating disinformation. This patchwork of Thanksgiving ruining racist uncles might look and sound like a bad joke, but they became a real force behind giving Donald Trump the keys to the White House." End quote. Which leads us, shamefully, sadly, to the lasting legacy of GamerGate. The one that really scares and really scars. The one that forms the largest backdrop to what we're talking about today. GamerGate and the tactics used by its proponents are assimilated as the template for the alt-right, and the ascendancy of MAGA is marked by the same attributes deployed across Reddit, 4chan, and Twitter. Memes, false allegations, and coordinated harassment, weaponized by the likes of Steve Bannon and Milo Yiannopoulos in service of electing that guy as US president in 2016. The tactics utilized in GamerGate are now the lingua franca of mainstream politics. American journalist David Neiwert said this, quote, "GamerGate heralded the rise of the alt-right and provided an early sketch of its primary features. An internet presence beset by digital trolls, unbridled conspiracism, angry white male identity victimization culture, and ultimately open racism, anti-Semitism, ethnic hatred, misogyny, and sexual and gender paranoia." End quote. There's no way around this. It's phenomenally depressing. And I don't think there's any way around this. GamerGate is a watershed moment in gaming that has had long-term effects that can never be undone. The perpetrators have been buoyed by their perceived successes in driving people into hiding or out of the industry altogether, and legitimised by the adoption of their anti-progressive agenda and tactics into the political mainstream. Subsequent generations of agitators, either legitimately right-wing or just simply bored, learn from this. The tactics become a template, and the cycle continues. Furthermore, GamerGate represents a line in the sand in perception. Mainstream media has long been suspicious of gamers, of gaming, and the effects of gaming on gamers and the effects of gamers on society. The moment-to-moment of GamerGate and its extensive, slow-burning fallout cements a view of gamers as a whole that will likely never be undone. Where do we go from there in attempting to draw something out of the mess of this past? One option is to go back to the start. The games that ostensibly kickstart this sorry saga are some really good ones. Depression Quest and Gone Home. Thoughtful and artistic pieces that push the medium into spaces it didn't previously occupy. Our history is littered with examples of progressive creatives so far ahead of their time that they suffered the unbeatable ire of the mainstream, only to go on in time to be recognised for the landmarks that they are. Artistic games were the way in. Artistic games, or art games, are a way out. It's a rainy day in November 2025, and rather than managing my finances or pairing up socks, I'm browsing the web for anything to do. I get an email newsletter from my local multidisciplinary art space, detailing everything going on there that week. Everything catches my eye every week, but something stands out in this one. This space runs talks every Friday, free to attend, and the one on this particular week has the standout title, Artgames After GamerGate, by a Dr. Rob Gallagher. Now, I obviously can't ignore something with a title like that, so even more obviously, I go. Now, I've been going to this particular multidisciplinary art space for the best part of 15 years, but I've never been to this part of it. I walk through offices, good offices, like cool, creative ones, to this little purpose-built annex, mostly exposed brickwork and natural light. As part of a small, but diverse and engaged audience, I listened to Dr. Gallagher provide an overview of his book, pitching the broad argument, the approach he took, and the games covered. It's interesting, it's intriguing, it's frequently darkly funny, and it's densely informative. I talked to Dr. Gallagher after, and, ultimately, we arrange a chat. As he works in London, I assume we'll do this online. It turns out, he lives down the road. Let's go for a drive. Hi, I'm Andrew. Welcome to Dialogue Tree. This is episode 37. Close reading. Dr. Rob Gallagher on Artgames After GamerGate.
Hello, I'm Dr. Rob Gallagher and I'm a lecturer in digital media industries at King's College London. My research and my teaching focus on digital culture and in particular digital games, and I've written 2 books about gaming. Video Games, Identity and Digital Subjectivity, which came out back in 2017, and Artgames After GamerGate, which came out late in 2025.
Dr. Rob Gallagher is a lecturer in digital media industries at King's College London, and currently the programme co-director of the Digital Future MA at that institution. Previously, he has worked at Royal Holloway, the University of East Anglia, Concordia University and Manchester Metropolitan University, where he held a position as a lecturer in film and media. When he was a postdoctoral fellow at Concordia's Technoculture Art and Games Lab, he led a team conducting a study of video game modding cultures. Between 2014 and 2019, he was part of Ego Media, an ERC-funded project focused on emerging forms of digital self-preservation based at King's. He's written for The Guardian, The New Inquiry and The Architectural Review, has appeared on the Critical Technology and Keywords in Play podcasts. He's been interviewed about his research by journalists from Radio Deutschland, Reuters and The New York Times. And there's no way I can articulate the breadth of Dr. Gallagher's work without quoting directly from his biography, so listen to this. Quote, Rob's research explores the expressive affordances of popular digital forms and genres, with a particular focus on video games. Much of his recent work has concentrated on art games and autobiographical games, and on the positioning of indie, DIY and avant-garde game creators relative to the commercial games industry. Other research interests include the role of the voice in digital media and the terms on which aesthetics and subcultures develop online, with case studies ranging from grime music and ASMR videos to alt-right memes. Informed by media theory and game studies, Rob's work is also heavily indebted to critical theories of identity, embodiment and subjectivity, from queer and trans theory to affect theory, post-humanist philosophy and critical theories of race. For me, someone with a lapsed interest in academia and a very active interest in nerdy gaming stuff, this is all impossibly cool to me. Dr. Gallagher has built a deep and fascinating body of work through close analysis of video games and the culture surrounding them. Browse his academic profiles and you can see that he, his colleagues, his students and peers have put out a vast, broad palette, fascinating work that will inform how we interpret games and their broader context now and long into the future. And that brings us to today, where, at the time of recording, he has recently published the book that was the subject of that talk, Artgames After GamerGate. You're getting all of this context as a means of conveying Dr. Gallagher's enviable credentials and, in turn, how fortunate I am to have him spare some time for the show. On a predictably cold day in February 2026, I sat down with Dr. Gallagher for some excellent coffee and to talk about his book, Artgames, and some spectacularly niche Sega Saturn games. I'll see you back here soon. Dr. Rob Gallagher, welcome to Dialogue Tree. Thanks for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks so much for inviting me on, and looking forward to talking about the book.
Yeah, we are here to talk about your academic paper, Artgames After GamerGate, which was published by Palgrave in November last year. We're going to talk about what an art game is, what your paper is, and what ideas it outlines, the games that you cover, and perhaps a bit about the present and future of art games and how they interpret our current socio-political climate. First, I thought we would talk a bit about you and your history in academia and the work that you have done that has led you to this paper. So, first of all, could you tell the listener about your current role and what your work focuses on?
Sure. So I'm a lecturer in digital media industries at King's College London, and I write and teach about digital culture in general, but specifically focusing on games. I'm interested in games as kind of expressive media. I'm also interested in how gaming culture influences and overlaps with other areas of culture. So how sort of aesthetics and ideas and language from games finds its way into meme culture, into music, into other parts of our lives.
And to contextualise how you've got to this point, can you recall like your earliest gaming experiences? Like, could you pinpoint a moment earlier in life that crystallised video games as something that can stand up to close reading, as something that you can study and learn from?
Sure, yeah. I was very much a console kid, and specifically a Sega kid. So grew up playing Mega Drive games, and think that really for me the default video game is still sort of a real-time control of an avatar you can see on screen type situation. And sort of graduated from the Mega Drive to the Saturn, which was a bit of a flop in the UK. And so began importing games. And at that point, there was already this sort of cultural gulf that you became aware of. I don't know when I first realized that a lot of the games I liked were coming out in Japan. So there was already a sense in which you had to sort of, literally try and understand what was going on, but also try and contextualize these strange media. And I think definitely going into like the PS2 era, my first book talks a lot about Silent Hill 2. Many people have obviously discussed that, but that was a big like, oh wow, games are doing really interesting things with a kind of very gothic genre of storytelling. Forbidden Siren as well, those games on the PS2. So possibly like survival horror games, obviously trying to be cinematic, and maybe for that reason kind of triggering some of those same interpretive kind of faculties. They were big for me. So yeah, I think it was partly like thinking about where do these things come from, video games, and how do I kind of understand their context that maybe put me on the road to wanting eventually to write and think about them professionally.
Yeah. I think you might be the first person that has come on the podcast who is a Sega kid.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's generally always people's early experiences on Nintendo. It's interesting hearing like the Saturn brought up as like a formative gaming experience.
I'm still ride or die for the Saturn. And I think just that era of 32, 64-bit where you can't quite, you're sort of cheating the sense of a coherent 3D space. There's still a lot of 2D games. There's 3D environments with sprites. There's flat textures with 3D models on top of them. It's such an interesting smorgasbord of different ways of sort of framing a game space and thinking about what a game could be. So I still find that era really fascinating.
Yeah. The development history of the Saturn is fascinating. Do you have a favourite Saturn game?
My official answer is Burning Rangers, as it's not necessarily the best. It's not necessarily my favourite. It's such a charming concept that you're like a future firefighter and you get emails from people you save. So that's, the one I tend to revert to.
That'll definitely be the first, possibly the last reference to Burning Rangers on this show. So from that point, from those early experiences importing games and becoming aware of like gaming being like a global concern, what is your path into academia?
Yeah, so I studied English literature at university, classic for somebody who's interested in culture and analysing culture, but maybe doesn't have a strong vocational drive towards a particular career. I enjoyed that and stuck around to do a master's, which was actually in late Victorian literature. So reading like Henry James, reading some Gothic literature, some sort of proto-queer literature, and then sort of bumbled around interning and volunteering and working in like animation, arts, film and TV, and was sort of interested in the internet and the possibility of whether there were ways to do the sort of cultural criticism I was interested in, but maybe in a way that was more outward facing than academia. I think this podcast is a great example of how you can do that sort of thing. But I personally was sort of sucked back into the academic orbit. So I did a PhD on a program that wasn't at all slanted towards games necessarily or to digital media. Was a general sort of cultural studies program where people were all investigating different types and eras of culture. Initially was interested in digital media and the way that they kind of speak to our bodies in a very visceral, direct way. And games sort of became a useful vehicle for thinking about that and became the centre of my PhD. And since then, I've sort of been attached to various universities and research projects, looking at things like digital identity or digital politics. But a lot of my work has sort of still focused on games, partly as vehicles to think through those themes.
Perhaps the last bit of setup that we need to do before we get on to talking about your book is to talk about GamerGate, which kind of provides the historical backdrop for the book. Did you remember where you were like during GamerGate? Like, can you remember much about your experiences of it and your feelings on it from the time?
Yeah, I definitely do. Partly because between the summer of 2013 and the summer of 2014, I lived in Montreal in Canada for a year and was working as a postdoctoral fellow at Concordia University's Technoculture Art and Games Lab, where at that point co-op mode were like developers in residence. There was lots of interesting stuff going on with gaming culture, and it felt like lots of reasons to be optimistic about where gaming culture was going. And GamerGate kind of hit just after we'd moved back to London. It didn't come out of a clear blue sky. There'd been a big contretemps about Gone Home the year before that feels like it sort of presages it. Mia Consalvo, who works at Concordia, she's written a lot about misogyny in gaming culture and the long history of that. But I remember being in the Stag on Orsman Road in Haggerston and getting messages from friends who weren't really into gaming, but who had obviously heard about this GamerGate thing, this sort of harassment of some of these developers and critics online, and also getting an email from the Digital Games Research Association, which is like this academic conference and association, saying, we really think you might want to turn on two-factor authentication because we think people are sort of trying to infiltrate our events or get email lists. So yeah, I do remember it. I remember being very disappointed that sort of commenters on gaming sites I went on regularly seemed to be very pro GamerGate, and maybe that was sort of naive of me. I never personally received any abuse. You get a lot of protection as a white cis het guy, I think. But there were 4chan discussions about like articles I published where they would be picking out all of the Jewish scholars I'd cited and putting echo brackets around their names and sort of saying various unsavory things. So it felt, yeah. And obviously, like people I know or friends of friends were obviously much more kind of directly impacted and affected. So yeah, I don't know how kind of remembered it is or what sort of status it has in the popular memory, but it felt quite seismic and significant at the time, definitely. And since then, a lot of people have sort of argued that it's this precursor to all of these other sort of online movements that kind of came to prominence in the 2010s.
I think we'll take a short break now, and when we come back from the break, we will talk about your book, Artgames After GamerGate. We are back from the break, and I am going to talk now to Dr. Rob Gallagher about his book, Artgames After GamerGate. So, Rob, your book was published by Palgrave in November of 2025. It's a heavily researched, highly detailed, close reading of a number of games. But for a better overview of what the book is, I'd like to throw this to you. Could you give the listener an elevator pitch for the work?
So maybe the best way to encapsulate it is to say that there's a question that runs throughout it, which is, when will video games grow up? And what would it mean for video games to grow up? And it sort of argues that gaming has long been haunted by this question, or maybe has been working towards this promise of becoming this sort of respected, broadly popular medium of expression, but has maybe struggled to quite get there. And as I said, I think in the early 2010s, there were sort of reasons for optimism in terms of those of us who wanted gaming to become this more mature art form encompassing different kinds of themes and experiences. And GamerGate really came as a big blow to lots of people who were hoping that this is what games were becoming. So the book is really saying these artists and these game designers who are very invested in games as a medium, but are also sort of progressive in their politics and also expansive in what they want games to be. How do you kind of react to this moment where you've seen sort of the worst side of gaming culture, this very reactionary, retrograde face of gaming culture, and you've had to confront the fact that that is still what games are for large numbers of people? So it's really, going through those case studies, saying what are their different modes of responding to this.
So to establish some of the basics of the book, could you describe what you mean in the title by art game, and why this is something very distinct from what we might commonly know as indie games?
Yeah, absolutely. So academics love to sort of argue about definitions and jargon. And I guess there's a few ways of talking about what an art game might be. And you might say it's a game that has a certain seriousness of intent, or is aesthetically experimental. So I guess you'd be thinking about like the content of the game there and saying it's artistic. People also talk about the kind of context of production. So was it made by a single individual or a small team and kind of expressing their vision? Obviously, that's also true of a lot of indie games. A lot of people would probably say that it has to be non-commercial. You can't be selling it as a product if it's also going to be art. I think though the games I talk about, they kind of qualify to varying extents on those criteria. But I think maybe the most interesting answer to this question is Phelan Parker talks about, well, art games are the games that people who are kind of gatekeepers or tastemakers decide are art games. So it's gallery owners or curators who say we want to feature this game in our exhibition or we want to add it to our permanent collection. It's juries on festival kind of prize panels. It's maybe critics. So he sort of says there's no inherent properties of an art game, but it's the sort of game that people in a place to make that decision think of and treat as art. Not necessarily saying that they are right or that they should be the ultimate arbiters of this, but that gets you, an interestingly kind of fuzzy space where I do talk about games that have been shown in galleries or have been made by people with sort of fine art degrees. Others maybe don't as obviously fit that model. I like to keep it open, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's definitely shown in the games that you talk about. And in the book, you take 5 games released within a very specific time frame. Now, those games are Sonic Dreams Collection, Ineffable Glossolalia, Black Room, The Game, and Oikaspiel, which are all released between 2015 and 2018. You use these games as case studies to explore the ways in which art games react to the socio-political environment of the 2010s, particularly in the context of the rise into the mainstream of right-wing dialogue and ideology. Now, why did you choose to focus on games released in this specific period of time?
Yeah, so obviously, if you're talking about responses to GamerGate, they're coming after the summer of 2014. COVID feels in all sorts of ways like a watershed moment. So it kind of caps off the decade, but also feels like a new phase in lots of ways. And really, these were the games that I was most interested in digging into. So they're running from pre-Trump to halfway through that administration, and that feels like a kind of seismic change as well in terms of these online movements that we get a taste of what they're capable of with Gamergate, seemingly being able to get a very reactionary president into the White House. It's partly that was when these games were made. I think they have these traits in common. I think there's a kind of particular moment in art game production, and partly, wanting to capture that period of shock, really, from 2014, where you have Gamergate, through 2015, 2016 is obviously Brexit and Trump, and the increasing kind of realization that there's a kind of quite well organized, quite sizable kind of right-wing contingent online and around us in culture.
And to briefly summarise what these games are, Sonic Dreams Collection is a fictional compilation of lost Sonic games that in varying ways allows players to exploit and undermine the iconography of the character. Ineffable Glossolalia is a subversion of the walking sim where players explore a series of environments that present a lost history of transbiography. Black Room is a browser game informed by the creator Cassie Makata's Insomnia that explores the misogynistic imagery of video games. The Game is a deconstruction of pickup artists through the frame of a dating sim that makes you the target. And Oikaspiel is a satire of the video game as a bottomless online marketplace that asks us to consider the environmental impact of the hobby. Now, that is to say, the form that these games take as critiques of the post-Gamergate environment are all very different, but you highlight 3 commonalities in how these games presented their analysis. And there's collage and reappropriation, ambivalence about gaming, and an interest in ludobiography. Why do you think the creators of these games are drawn to these 3 approaches?
Yeah, I think to start with the ambivalence one. So when I say ambivalence, I don't mean they're not bothered, whatever. I mean they're pulled in conflicting directions. So they obviously, these games sort of demonstrate a knowledge of gaming and an affection for gaming's history, but they're also sort of appalled by aspects of gaming culture. And I think that is something that comes out of this moment of responding to Gamergate and being confronted with some of the worst sides of gaming culture. Appropriation, this is partly, all digital games are sort of databases of digital files, sound files and models and textures on some level. And obviously you can rip them apart and pick out the pieces and reconfigure them. So they're collages in that's the thing they do in order to engage with gaming's history in many cases. This is also an era where you're starting to see the rise of asset libraries, which again very much foreground this idea that you don't need to make all of your own assets. You can kind of pick and mix all of these bits and pieces. So they're responding to that. The biographical element, this was really central, I think, to some of these discussions around indie games and art games and how they were going to be different from commercial games. And certainly in the more experimental space, games like Anna Anthropy's Dysphoria were sort of heralded as these examples of how games could be very personal, but also political. So part of what it was to be an art game was maybe to think about what kinds of resources the games have to allow us to talk about identity or to share aspects of our histories. And again, these games are doing these things in different ways to different extents, but it felt like a way of sort of drawing a circle around what was happening in art game production at this time, I guess.
One of the most interesting ideas that your paper presents and keeps in mind throughout is one that you mentioned at the top. It's initially posited by sociologist Graham Kirkpatrick, and that video games never quite succeeded in becoming a grown-up art form. And you follow up on this with a quote from the game designer Stephen Gilmurphy, which I think is great, so I'm just going to give that verbatim here. Video games are these sarcophagi that mostly exist to preserve the pre-internet imagination of what computer entertainment would entail. Sometimes I think video game theorists would be better off thinking of the format as already dead and moving to the question, what can you do with a dead medium? I found that like a really striking idea.
Sort of maddening. I don't know if you've played the anthology of the Killer games yet.
No.
But Stephen's like an amazing game developer and also just a wildly articulate and thoughtful critic of games.
I definitely got that from his thoughts there. So, and you examine the validity of this argument as well as presenting arguments to the contrary. How do you feel now, like post-publishing, about the idea of video games as a dead medium? Like, should video game theorists adopt this as a default, or is it an approach that would benefit developers?
It's obviously a sort of provocation or a thought experiment in some ways. How would we look at games differently if we sort of gave up on the hope that they're going to mature and arrive and sort of shed their chrysalis? I think that thing of never quite growing up, all of the developers I talk about are also millennials. It's also part of a generational feeling that the sort of pattern of a normal or a good life that was handed down to this whole generation was maybe coming under stress. So I think we could also say, well, what does it mean to grow up? Does it have to mean what we thought it meant? Does gaming struggle to be taken seriously speak to a kind of broader debate around what we think it is to be an adult or to be successful? But yeah, I think if we were to take this thought experiment forward to say, right, let's accept games are a dead medium, you're kind of freed from this constant forward impetus that has kind of driven the games industry for such a long time in terms of technology, innovation, new hardware, new ideas. And I think we're seeing that model's not really sustainable, partly because obviously hardware chips are harder to get hold of these days. The price of gaming hardware is going up. That chase for like the shiny new graphics seems to be bottoming out. Even people seem to be spending less time and less money on games, according to certain data that's coming out. So I think there are all sorts of reasons why we might want to abandon or at least question that drive to always be looking forward, moving on to the next big thing, waiting for games to arrive, and be saying, if this is what games are and always will be, what do we do with that? And possibly also, how do we look back and look at other paths that the medium could have taken at points in its history?
I thought it might be useful, interesting for the listener, if we look at a couple of the games in the context of this idea, namely Tabitha Nicolai's Ineffable Glossolalia and Arcane Kid's Sonic Dream Collection. Learning about Ineffable Glossolalia was kind of the most affecting part of the book for me. It showed me something that I would never experience elsewhere and found it quite unsettling, sort of even just reading about it. Tabitha's work presents a history of the trans experience that was effectively erased from popular memory through book burning in Nazi Germany, whilst simultaneously challenging the positive representation of certain individuals involved in the documentation of that history. It's quite a weighty and important story, and one that is not told elsewhere. And then there's Sonic Dreams Collection, which is this anarchic, ostensibly comedic compilation of subversive game sketches that shares several characteristics with confrontational meme culture that has become part of the default language of the social internet. So how can we read these games in the light of that idea? If we assume that the creators of these games accept the medium is dead, what do they do with it?
Yeah, and you're right, drawing out those two, probably Tabitha's work you'd see on the sublime end and Sonic Dreams Collection on the ridiculous ends, although it's a little more complex than that. And they're both interested in archiving, looking back, recovering these kinds of lost materials, speculating about these gaps in history. So yeah, Tabitha is looking back to this period in what we now think of as queer and trans history, where I don't know how widely it's sort of known or remembered that the first Nazi book burnings are actually materials from the library of this Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin that Magnus Hirschfeld started. So that's obviously quite a harrowing story in its own right. Tabitha also doesn't just sort of deify Hirschfeld or turn him into a martyr. He had some pretty questionable ideas. So it gets quite deep into these quite painful histories in a really nuanced way. But in doing so, Tabitha also incorporates, I think, elements of the ridiculous or the messy or the juvenile bits of games. So it's a very serious game in some ways, but I mean, there's a Quake 3 poster at one point in the game in this sort of scene that is set in a like 90s noughties gamer's bedroom. And in some ways, like Tabitha's approach to this space that you move around in is much more similar to the sort of mishmash of different architectural styles, the teleporters, the kind of gubbins of Quake than it is like the attempt to make a like grounded reproduction of a real space that you see in walking simulators like Gone Home. And Arcane Kids, yes, there's a lot that's kind of silly and anarchic and provocative in how they're using Sonic the Hedgehog, and it's sort of maybe poking fun at the Sonic fandom. But there's also an attempt to think about fandom and our attachment to video games, how that can be exploited by corporations. And again, whether gaming is too attached to its own past and whether that's sort of constrained the medium in certain ways. So yeah, I think they're obviously operating in very different registers and different genres, but the way they're speaking to that thing of, if we imagine games as a dead medium, what do you do with it, is partly like occupying the position of the archivist and sort of digging through to recover these bits and pieces and juxtapose them in a way that's meant to make you think about memory and mediation and your own past with games, I guess. And that's, I think, true of all of the games to varying extents.
Tabitha's work outside of Ineffable Glossolalia is kind of in these digital recreations of like dead mall spaces, which I found quite interesting. And the section that you wrote about the Quake 3 poster, what it says about gamers dissociating themselves from their bodies, I found quite harrowing to read. When you recognise traits of yourself in these really quite like negative spaces, that's an eye-opening thing. So one last point on Sonic Dreams Collection and Arcane Kids. You write about a few things that came to light in the wake of the release of the game. One of the developers, Aryan Prakash, reported that he was excluded from the project and failed to receive proper credit for the work that he did. Arcane Kids issued a statement in response to this where they said, "We've always worked as a loosely organised collective making joke games, but we do plan on creating commercial work in the future. We're learning and growing, and we hope to be making games together for a long time." So you point out that statement, in part, by positioning Arcane Kids' DIY approach as in some way lesser than commercial contemporaries, that it undermines the validity of their work. And since then, Ben Esposito, who's one of the key creatives behind Arcane Kids, has released Donut County, which at least within sort of the indie gaming world was like quite a big success. And the game seems to share something ideologically with the works detailed in your book. The game sees you sort of effectively destroying civilization by swallowing like core societal infrastructure into a hole which is itself the product of corporate greed. And it's all presented in this kind of gleefully obnoxious way that has something in common with the boundary-probing meme culture of the time period that your book covers. Now, do you think that this game, if you have experience of it, represents a continuation of the sort of constructive iconoclasm of Sonic Dreams Collection, or is it something? Does it represent a capitulation into something less intellectually interesting? Has Ben Esposito succeeded in learning and growing, or not?
Great question. And I guess there's the sort of artistic side to that and the, I don't know, ethical side. I think the situation with Prakash is a reminder that as much as these kinds of DIY spaces can be more improvisatory and open and they're not constrained by kind of professional decorum, that can sometimes allow kind of inequalities or just thoughtlessness to stop people feeling like they have ownership over their work. Aesthetically, Donut County, I have to confess, I didn't really get along with. I think it's really interesting because, as you say, it's so openly misanthropic. And it you would look at it and assume it might be a like cozy or wholesome game. It's very much in that sort of low poly woodland creature aesthetic, but you're asked to just like be this voracious appetite that is swallowing bits of California in this sort of nakedly profiteering way. So I found it like interesting thematically and aesthetically, and how it was sort of cutting against this cozy trend with something more misanthropic. I do really like Neon White, which he went on to make. Yes. And I think you do see continuities with the Arcane Kids stuff there. I know a lot of people didn't get along with the writing, but I think mechanically a lot of their games, and also in terms of level design, there's this kind of teasing, slightly antagonistic relationship with the player, where they're saying, do you think you can go over there? Well, you try. And, oh, you think you discovered that? Well, actually, we anticipated you doing that. That's not an exploit or a glitch. That's something that we designed in. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic, almost regardless of what kind of message it's trying to convey. This sense of the relationship between the player and the designer, having that kind of push and pull. And yeah, I mean, the Arcane Kids manifesto, when they were working as a collective, the purpose of video games is to hide secrets, is like one of the tenets. And I think that's a really sort of fruitful way to think about games. And I think their games, Sonic Dreams Collection, in some ways sort of the least serious and the least politically hefty of the games I talk about, but maybe mechanically and how it's using mechanics and level design to say things, very sophisticated in that way. So yeah, I remain curious about what Ben and the rest of the Arcane Kids do next, certainly.
Yeah.
Even as, yeah, there's obviously a degree of sort of polish to the newer work that makes it quite different.
Yeah.
I'm kind of blanking now, which is bad of me, on the other Arcane Kids names, but one of them also worked on Journey as a feel engineer, which is an interesting post. And I would say, I mean, Journey is so slick and so accomplished and is aiming for a certain kind of profundity that I kind of prefer the kind of messiness and antagonism of their other stuff. Because that sort of feels a little too achieved and then perhaps a little too poised for me.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that overview of the book and some of the games featured in it. I think for now we'll take another short break, and when we come back we will look ahead and we will talk a little bit more about what the future is for Artgames. Artgames After GamerGate is a weighty academic paper. It is dense with references and ideas, but also, for me, an engaging and compelling read that I struggled to put down in the same way that I struggled to put down more nominally accessible works. Now, the risk of sounding redundant, it's a supremely interesting and informative read. In almost every sentence, I feel like I'm learning something new, going deeper into an unknown world, but being guided by an expert hand. It takes 5 games and analyses them in the context of GamerGate and the rise of the alt-right. We've talked a little about Sonic Dreams Collection. I like it, and the abrasive, chaotic, deconstructionist relationship with gaming iconography that it fosters. And also, because I'll kind of always be interested in seeing people make fun of Sonic. The flip side is that, while I will always appreciate the undermining of any sacred cow, I find it hard to see past the mode and form that Sonic Dreams Collection presages. The morally and politically ambivalent, button-pushing, laughs-first approach that we have come to expect from online discourse. We've talked about Tabitha Nicolai's work, including Ineffable Glossolalia, and how that could not be more different in how it interprets the post-GamerGate world. That game is a bleak and troubling look at an unreported side of history through real-world spaces recreated through collage and made memorably uncomfortable through their lopsided, slightly nightmarish, half-remembered feel. 32-bit aesthetics have been in vogue for a while now, but Nicolai was manipulating this visual style years previously. The wonky, polygonal look of the late 90s and early noughties is repurposed not for nostalgic reasons, but for the sense of unreality that it fosters. Realistic enough to represent a separation from the cartoon look of the games that came pre-97, but not technologically capable of truly recreating real-world spaces. This graphical style is used by Nicolai to present an unstable, unreal netherworld where the broken walls and ceilings, inconsistent textures and blurred lines reflect our own broken and inconsistent world. Collage, as a standalone means of expression, has been around since the 10th century, taking shape as a mainstream art form in the 20th, but it's only in relatively recent history that the form of it that we see in these games has become a recognised standard. Reappropriated assets, expectations subverted, collage and chaos. The cut and paste, mixed media aesthetic came of age in the late 80s and throughout the 90s, by turns playful, countercultural, whimsical and political, with the form evolving over the years to accommodate the wildest extremes of those attributes. That's what we see in the work of Arcane Kids and Tabitha Nicolai. For them, that is the way to respond to GamerGate. To cut and to paste the visual noise of the real world into a digital one in service of reflecting a truth of that world. Its bleakness, its ugliness, its emotional emptiness. I admire these games as much as I am deflated by them. That's not to say they are without joy. They are genuinely impressive creative showcases, ones that challenge what we deem a game, or even fun. Sometimes that's the price of admission. It's that cost, that tension between art and accessibility, that makes the game the game. And this one is hard. It is patently smart, a fully realised subversion of the dating sim that punctures its subjects and their absolute towering bull with unwavering precision. In that respect, it's important. Angela Washko's work is a genuinely insightful and helpful resource in understanding how the snake oil salesmen manipulate and cajole. It's an interactive encyclopedia of modern social anthropology, a document of how a certain strand of the terminally online, informed and activated by the techniques and tactics of GamerGate and the nascent alt-right, sought to manipulate and abuse those they perceived as powerless. These people gamify human relationships in the most inhumane ways, mechanising basic interactions and in doing so debasing the concept of connection on which most of our lives and loves are built. My way of reckoning with the unpleasantness on which Washko's game is built is that, in laying bare the mechanics of these mechanical thinkers, it provides a useful, timeless document on how to deal with them. The damage these people do is, on the face of it, on a smaller scale than the nameless, faceless groups of agitators that cause innocent people to upend their lives to escape abuse, on a smaller scale than the nameless, faceless groups of agitators whose tactics inform the root of political discourse. But the damage these people do is something I hate thinking about just as much. Knowing these individuals with their names, their faces, their brands and their followers are out there, insidious, ever-present, is a hard reality to face. I find that cost, that tension that dominates the game, hard to bear. Accepting that we will pass, and must pass something on to the generations that follow. I hope these people are not all that we do. I'm not an insomniac, but I'm not good at sleep. Cassie Mercator's Black Room, a game informed by the creator's experiences of her insomniac mother playing games at night and their own struggles with sleep, is the game here that I find the least abrasive, the least troubling. It tackles troubling subject matter. It presents the unshakable nature of sexism, so pervasive that it invades the conscious and the unconscious, the waking hours and the waking nightmare. And still, there is something comforting, something inviting about it. Black Room is something different from what we've seen before. A dream for the dreamless. Just listen. Open Black Room in a browser. Your avatar, a sprite taken from somewhere else, is on a 2D plane. You can move left and right. Move left and be told there's no way back. Move right and you move forward. You move through 16-bit inspired environments. You are Altered Beast. You are Victor Belmont. You are Samus Aran. A desert plain whose sky turns from day to night as you move, stars fading into view, gentle and soft. These environments quickly become less logical. Dream logic, nightmare logic. Impossible figures, impossible assets. Collisions only possible when the human imagination is left to its own devices. Black Room reflects that, what your brain does to you when you can't control it. Blinking, you find yourself in a dark room. You stumble forward, your fingers searching for something solid. Resize the browser to find hidden items. So you explore each screen. There are sprites of characters, flowers, candelabras, animals. Most things are clickable. Most things link out somewhere else. You resize the browser window to find new things. Hover over a candle to invert the lighting. Some assets link out to videos of waves, or videos of mountains streaking by, or Google searches for black folding chairs, or Google searches for forget-me-not bloom near the swamp where I used to play. A small flame burns in an imaginary field. My mother taught me this game, which her mother taught her. A trick for falling asleep. Wanting to please my mother, I played the game. The temperature drops drastically. Wrapping your arms around yourself, you're engulfed by a bright fog. The cave is dark and chilly. Strange candles and glowing insects light your way. There's only one direction to go. I can never hold more than a couple of furnishings. Before having to start over, through the darkness you begin to recognise solid shapes. I was sure there was a winning of the game. Your eyes are adjusting. My stress became more when I remembered I had forgotten a chair or vase in the corner. Why can't I hold the room together? Is that not the point of the game? I let myself leave the room if I feel calm enough. There's something in the palmed fronds. Instead of leading me to other rooms then, I find myself disappeared to a paved street, like ribbons or debris or animals. I return and I'm in the room again holding a flower, a white one. The blackness of the room is nauseating. I think it's supposed to be a play on the back of the eyelids. The darkness is supposed to be a comfort to invoke sleep. It leaves me paranoid and forgetful. My mother taught me this game. I was convinced it should work. Can the game exist outside of myself? Outside of my body? Where is the room when I am awake? And where is the room when I am asleep? A sweet smelling memory blossoms. In the old cemeteries I made traces of tombstones. My hair was long, my nail polish light pink and chipped. I thought I was romantic and edgy. You'll know the way out when you see it. Unlike other games covered in the book, I find Black Room in how it invites you to lean in and get lost, in how it replicates the bottomless void of a sleepless state, comforting. That's somewhat at odds with Makeda's intentions, with the game pitched as a feminist dungeon crawler that, with its frequent use of sexualised sprite work, highlights and documents objectified representation of female bodies through video game history, and explores Makeda's own history of gaming through her experiences with these characterisations. It's comforting in the sounds it makes. The fact that you are not guided through the game in the way you are with others in the book. You find your own way. Quickly, you are overwhelmed. You open multiple browser tabs, which one being home harder and harder to remember. Your browser is on fire. The game becomes less comforting. Bodies of women just another asset in the mess of the modern web. We see this across all these games. They react to the active abuse of GamerGate by documenting the passive abuse committed over several decades by the arts. Black Room is, like the others, bleak. Black Room is, unlike the others, beautiful. Something interesting about these games is the fact that time is making them less accessible. They won't run on many modern computers. As Rob mentions in the book, Artgames are in part defined by their presence in museums. That may be the fates and future of these games. Let's talk about that future. So I'm back from the break one last time with Dr. Rob Gallagher, and now we are going to look ahead at the future of Artgames. So Rob, your paper looks at how video games responded to a rise of intolerance and hate speech legitimised, encouraged and exploited by mainstream politics. That environment is arguably worse today. Have you observed any changes in how Artgames have responded to this? Is there an apparent next epoch of Artgames?
Yeah, this is a perfectly reasonable question to ask someone who has just published a book on Artgames and their relationship to politics, and yet I'm not sure I have a satisfactory answer. Partly because I've slightly taken my eye off that ball and have been thinking about other aspects of gaming culture. I'm sort of loath to say there was something peculiar to that mid-2010s moment that there's not an equivalent of now. And obviously we've seen things like the controversy over horses recently, which seems to have been partly a matter of right-wing pressure groups attacking credit cards, companies and distribution platforms to try and remove adult software from gaming platforms, and that seems like quite a lively front in the culture war. There are interesting things happening in the kind of art games sector, as in the kinds of games you might find in galleries, many of which are around sort of procedural generation, machine learning, trying to get to grips with the implications of these technologies. And I think games are an interesting place to work out what generative AI might mean for us as a species. But I think maybe part of what's happened is it feels like there is a progressive game space that one can maybe occupy, where I think it's probably easier to divest, certainly from the AAA scene, but maybe even from other aspects of the indie scene, and find developers whose politics you probably agree with, who are making 3D platformer, beat 'em up, whatever genre. So it's almost like there's this different space within gaming culture that is not necessarily making experimental or overtly political games, but is part of a section of gaming culture that has kind of had its own values honed or forged through GamerGate and what came after it. I don't know if that feels like something you would agree with or not, because yeah, as you can tell, I'm not quite sure what I think the current phase of this kind of dynamic is.
Do you think that was there an art game response to COVID?
Interesting. I mean, I think one of the things, so my first book was thinking a lot about games as media to help us think about our relationship with digital technologies. And this was sort of the post-Snowden era. So lots of dynamics around surveillance, the circulation of information and misinformation online, kind of authoritarian and anti-authoritarian tendencies in culture. And I think there are a lot of games that are still doing really interesting things with that. I'm completely blanking on the excellent game which has its own near future Wikipedia, where you're kind of puzzling out a is it Neurocracy? That is obviously a kind of an attempt to talk about our information environment. There were sort of interesting games about influencer culture. I don't know if they're all art games in the sense I've kind of defined it, but I certainly think there's lots of interesting stuff happening in this space, and that particularly when we think about the impact of digital technologies on society and culture, games are really well placed to say interesting things about that in terms other media can't.
So reading about and playing some of these games can be quite a challenging experience. Some games, I'm thinking of Black Room and Oikespiel in particular, that really forced me to look at gaming in a less than flattering light. And it made returning to any game where I'm sort of like just jumping on heads or digging up weeds feel pretty trivial and frivolous. As someone who closely analyses these games and thinks about them in a broader context, do you find it difficult to disconnect that critical part of your brain when you just want to play something for fun?
I know what you mean, and I don't necessarily finish a hard day's teaching, boot up my Steam Deck on the train and play an art game. I'm probably going to make a little man jump around. And I think, yeah, I might be projecting here, but I think with Black Room, for example, I think part of the reason Cassie McQuater is so angry and disappointed with the games industry is that she has sort of some affection for these games. I'm certainly, I don't boycott the King of Fighters series because there's like some problematic sprite work in there. And in fact, I really like 90s action games, some of the very sort of campy to the point of decidedly problematic ones. So yeah, I think they occupy a different space. It's not necessarily competing for the same kind of attention or the same part of your time. And I absolutely suffer from that thing of like, I really should play this, but I'd rather play something that's more immediately gratifying or not as much of a downer.
Yeah. Okay, on that note, what are you playing at the moment?
Mix of stuff. I'm very pleased that The Outfoxies has been re-released via Arcade Archives. It's cool that old weird games are getting official re-releases of that kind. I've just started playing Blue Stinger on the Dreamcast.
Nice.
And I'm halfway through a second playthrough of Silent Hill F, which I guess around about this time last year I played Sorry We're Closed. Yeah, interesting. Like two very different but quite traditional takes on like 2000s, late 90s survival horror. So yeah, as I say, not necessarily. I've yet, in fact, to play Tabitha's new game, but
the new one.
Yeah, Limbic Hotel, I believe it's called. So yeah, mix of stuff. But again, I like mostly like Japanese real-time third-person console games. I guess that's still kind of the type of game I most enjoy and maybe like thinking about.
There's some good homework to be going away with there. I'm glad you brought up Silent Hill, because when you mentioned it earlier, I said, I was going to ask you, have you played Silent Hill F? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, your second playthrough, I'm guessing you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, they sort of seed it with some tantalizing things about. I know I'd heard a lot in advance about what a kind of brave feminist statement it was, and they kind of keep a lot of stuff back. I'm interested in it, where it's going, but yeah, I don't know. Have you played it?
No, I haven't.
I mean, great atmosphere, lovely fog, and there is something, and it is very traditional in strange ways. That the early Silent Hill games, where it's not open world yet, but it's quite a big urban space. So yeah, I'm not sure there's been as much that's different in the second playthrough as I would have liked, and it doesn't feel like it's being quite as brave. I really like that aspect of certain older Silent Hill games where they basically try and interpret your gameplay. Which Shattered Memories obviously does as well, but Silent Hill 2 does, of like, oh, you don't heal much. We're going to interpret that as this version of James Sunderland feels this way about himself. It doesn't seem to be doing that. So I would say worth playing.
So lastly, what is next for you? Like, what are you working on next? Is there another book in the works, or what are you teaching now?
Sure. Well, I am about to visit Belgium, actually, to go to the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and going to be talking about NPCs. So I published a paper a few years ago with another academic called Rob Gallagher at Birkbeck, who does a lot of work on digital politics, about the NPC meme, and this kind of idea that travels from 4chan via Reddit, first of all as a way of sort of making fun of normies and liberals, but then sort of mutates via TikTok, and this idea of the NPC in culture. So we're going to be playing some games about watching NPCs. Going to be playing The Crush House, that reality TV satire, which I think is interesting in lots of ways, and Umurangi Generation, and watching a machinima by a Marxist art collective called Total Refusal, where they just follow NPCs in Red Dead Redemption 2 as they go about their work, which I'd really recommend. It's like a short video, 20 minutes on Vimeo. So we're going to be thinking about games and art that ask you to sort of watch NPCs and what we think of the NPC in an era where that's sort of become part of the jargon, calling people NPCs or acting like an NPC or feeling like an NPC.
That sounds great. That's really interesting. Good luck with that. So lastly, I think all I need to do now is throw to you to promote the book and your socials and anything else you want the listener to know about.
Sure. So it's an academic book, so it's like ruinously expensive, because the idea is that if you're affiliated with a university, one of the things you get is access to all of these expensive books. But I'm trying to sort of appear on podcasts and give talks so that there's there's other ways of engaging with some of the arguments. So I won't necessarily pretend people are going to spend north of £100 on a single book. But I am always happy to talk about and discuss it, and to find occasions like this one to try and bring some of those ideas to different audiences. I'm on Blue Sky. It's not really hitting like Twitter used to, but that's probably a good thing. Not sure I have much else to promote, really. But
if people want to talk to you, they can do so on Blue Sky to engage with you about like the arguments in the book.
Yeah, Blue Sky, email me. I am for my sins on LinkedIn. But yeah, always happy to chat about it, and maybe even to find ways to circumvent that £100 price tag if people really want to get their hands on a copy of the book. There are potentially ways and means to make that happen. So yeah, very happy to have people reach out to discuss anything we've chatted about today, really.
Great. That's a great call to action. Yeah, and there'll be links to everything in the show notes, including appearances that you've made on other podcasts. Dr. Rob Gallagher, that is all I have today. Thank you very much for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
No, it was a lot of fun. I obviously the book is sort of taking this very critical stance on games. It was nice to talk about like things I like and enjoy and then play. So thanks.
In 2024, in a fittingly distasteful way of marking the 10th anniversary of GamerGate, right-wing agitators found a new target, a narrative design studio called Sweet Baby Inc. The mission statement of this agency is to help game developers tighten up their scripts, ensure stories are logical, consistent, and so on. Between a group on Steam and a Discord server with members totaling in the hundreds of thousands, the members of Sweet Baby Inc. were targeted with a campaign of threats, abuse, and doxing, all on the basis that they were secretly influencing game development, covertly directing studios towards diversity, equality, and inclusivity. At the time, Donald Trump was gearing up for a second run at the US presidency. This probably doesn't need pointing out, but perpetuating SJW issues or the woke mind virus is not something on Sweet Baby's to-do list. They're a small agency who help developers, who are not always best equipped to write believable and engaging characters, tell stories. Sometimes what they do isn't even that grandiose. For the Suicide Squad game, they simply pitched in some jokes. Furthermore, in a great interview with Nathan Grayson over at Aftermath, Sweet Baby Inc.'s CEO Kim Belair said this, quote, "We're a narrative consultancy. We're not in charge of placements. We're not in charge of building teams. We don't get reached out to like, how should we hire people?" End quote. Naturally, this fine print is not important to the disciples of GamerGate. Nuance, or just basic facts, are not in play here. What's important to those disciples is the perpetuation of the conspiracy theory, the fabrication of a fight, the constant ongoing mobilisation of new acolytes. This is how the right has thrived. Racist, misogynistic, anti-progressive views were up until relatively recently predominantly the preserve of older generations, the hope being that time would simply wash all this away, that death itself would save us. That has been proven false. The right has found how to survive. By recruiting the young, by restarting the cycle. Steve Bannon said this, quote, "You can activate that army. They come in through GamerGate or whatever, and then get turned on to politics and Trump." End quote. The brief life of the Sweet Baby controversy is instructive in determining how to process gaming in a post-GamerGate world. This entirely fabricated conspiracy theory burns hot, making life hell for innocent people, passing quickly out of the mainstream news cycle but still bubbling under the surface. Its very existence is proof of the legacy of GamerGate. Whatever entirely fabricated conspiracy comes next will be the legacy of Sweet Baby. On the other hand, at the other extreme, we can look to the people who lived through this and survived. We can look to Keza MacDonald, who experienced all of this firsthand. Her take, which I think neatly surmises what we do know to be true, even if we are scared to vocalise it. Quote, "Look at GamerGate. What did it actually achieve? Games are more diverse than they were 10 years ago, not less. I saw more non-white male faces and characters in this year's spate of Summer Game Fest trailers and demos than at any previous time in the almost 20 years I've been covering games." End quote. She goes on to write this in another article, quote, "Nobody is forcing diversity into video games. It is happening naturally, as players and developers themselves diversify. The games industry knows that a greater breadth of content featuring a greater breadth of characters made with the contributions of a greater breadth of people is good for creativity and for business, no matter what some aggrieved gamers may think." End quote. These two extremes coexist, and it's important to remember that. The brutal rollback of DEI and the way companies big and small have capitulated to the whims of history's most powerful, intellectually stunted man-child is bleak. But he will pass. To make sure that what follows is better, voices must be raised now. Artgames After GamerGate is a work that requires you to accept many of these uncomfortable truths in order to engage with it. In the introduction to the conclusion of his book, Dr. Gallagher posits a few ideas, and some even knottier questions, including this, quote, "More than a decade after the event, how should we understand GamerGate's impact? Was it a storm in a teacup, quickly superseded by other, graver crises? Or did it foment a wider toxic or extremist turn in online culture that gave us the alt-right, the MAGA movement, and QAnon? Was GamerGate evidence that gamers are particularly susceptible to right-wing radicalisation? Or was the attention it received attributable to the fact that it played to existing stereotypes about games and gamers?" I kind of come down on the more cynical side of this, a stance supported by Gonzalo C. Garcia's novel We Are the End, which Rob covers in tandem with Gabriel Zevin's 2022 novel Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow as two responses to GamerGate. The former paints the bleaker picture. It does perhaps subscribe to the theory posited by the question Rob has in mind throughout his work, quote, "Would it be so bad to admit that video games have missed their shot at fulfilling their potential and shaking off the stigma that remains attached to them? What if we were to accept that, far from being a vital future-facing medium, games are already dead, end quote. It's a neat idea and one that raises further challenging questions. Now, forgive me one last quote bomb here, but I think this is important, a key in understanding where art games are coming from and where we go from here. This vision of the art game relieves us of the need to revoke the video game status as promising object, allowing us to continue looking forward to a happy ending wherein games finally prove themselves worthy of our love. Similar charges could be levelled at this book and at much video game criticism. When is ostensibly critical work complicit in renewing or sustaining the promise of a medium with a track record of failing to deliver on the pledges it makes? To what extent is it fair to see such work as a means of attempting to make good on hours wasted playing, or of sustaining the allure of commodities we cherished as children? How can we cultivate a more inclusive culture, or celebrate attempts to break new expressive ground, without sustaining rhetorics of progress and possibility? End quote. This all perfectly surmises and articulates the duality of the works Dr. Gallagher covers, the extremes of GamerGate and the reaction to it, and the difficulty in knowing how to respond to the troubles the world throws at us. In Artgames after GamerGate, Dr. Gallagher writes about the lessons learned from each case study. These lessons highlight how gaming is inherently political, socially, sexually, and environmentally. These games reflect the world, they shape how we see it. They critique the excesses while making use of them. They are above the crude, the misogynistic, the abusive, while in several examples, in several cases, co-opting and perpetuating the artistic vision of those impulses. Art games are endlessly interesting, unfathomably messy. The big picture of popular culture in micro. I like drawing neat conclusions to leave episodes on a high note, but to do so here would be intellectually dishonest and supremely patronising. And also, I'm just some dork on the internet. It's not my place to reduce an actual real-life doctor's work into a sentence to simply benefit this show. Dr. Gallagher's work does not draw a neat, simplistic conclusion, because there isn't one. GamerGate and its legacy has ensured that there will always be something to push back against. There will always be a toxic mainstream demanding a response. The goalposts will always be moving. Art games will provide that response, and Rob's book documents the deep, diverse, creatively thriving world that forms it. That these games cannot be easily grouped under an easily digestible umbrella term is, I think, to their credit. There are no co-optable slogans or monetizable stylistic choices. These games cannot be packaged. These games are evidence that art games evolve with the medium. They evolve with the mainstream they respond to. And it would be nice if we could evolve with them. My thanks once more to Dr. Rob Gallagher for his time in discussing his book. It is a fascinating, engaging, and educational work, and if you want to check it out, Rob gave you a few ways in which you can do so. Like I said, there is no neat conclusion, but there have to be some closing thoughts, and so what I've learned is that the opposing ends of gaming culture are more extreme than I thought. The bad actors are worse, but the depth of experiences and cultures represented by video games is deeper and broader and more diverse than I ever imagined. That line earlier, games are more diverse than they were 10 years ago, not less, rings true, which gives me hope that I didn't have at the start of this episode. The developers showcased in Rob's book, Tabitha Nicolai and David Kananga especially, have produced works of a textual depth that invite forensically close reading in the long term while providing immersive gaming experiences in the short. The challenge now is in platforming these games and these voices, and ensuring the lessons learned from GamerGate are the right ones. For those who left, don't let that be in vain. Thanks for listening. In the episode description you can find a link to the show notes, which includes information on everything that Rob and I have talked about today. The artwork for Dialogue Tree was designed by Pixel Benny, and you can find the show online at dialoguetree.cc. Talk to you next time.